Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. Want to watch more from Acton? Visit ondemand.acton.org. There you will find hundreds of lectures, conferences, and Acton events through the years. They're categorized, free, and more content is regularly added.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Stephen Barrows, Chief Operating Officer here at Acton, and also a trained economist. So this comes in handy because today we're going to be talking about Catholic social teaching and sort of the science of economics. What's the relationship between faith and social science? And how do the folks at the Acton Institute seek to integrate faith and economics in service of the common good? Steve, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
So when we talk about economics sometime, economics is like meteorology in that, it's tremendous, but, comes in for a lot of criticism because, the common criticism is, if you're so smart, know how the economy works, why aren't you rich?
Right.
Why doesn't economics give us the sort of predictions that sort of like physics, gives us, we can tell things fall at 9.8 meters per second, but we can't tell anything about sort of, where the economic winds are blowing at a particular time. So when we talk about economics as a science and a social science, what do we mean by that? And how is it different than some of the other physical sciences that people are more familiar with?
Sure. So before I answer the question, since you brought up meteorology, I'm going to have to invoke something from my past. So once upon a time, I did work and teach in the Department of Economics and Geosciences at the Air Force Academy. And so we had, of course, the economics major, we had a geoscience major, and we also had a shared major with the physics department, which was a meteorology major. And so there was this running joke between the economists and the meteorologists about which made the better predictions. And so as you pointed out so rightly, economists and meteorologists both get grief for having predictions that are off. So when it comes to, the whole topic of economics, I like to say that when I used to teach my students, economics is simply the study of human action under conditions of scarcity. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about human action, right off the bat, that raises some questions and some comparisons to other fields. So for example, human action as such, economists just take a look and observe what are human beings actually doing, right? And then we assess, on the basis of scarcity, certain trade-offs that are involved with that kind of action. But what we typically don't do is ask what are the underlying motivations behind those actions, which would be reserved to the field of psychology. Nor would we ask really typically whether or not those are good or bad actions in terms of a moral sense. That would be left to the field of ethics. Yeah. Okay, so when we talk about economics as, say, a science and how it might be distinguished from other types of sciences, there's going to be a little bit of a split among economists here. Now, I approach economics objectively as a deductive science. You start off with certain axioms. This is what Austrian economists would typically say. There's certain objective things, axioms you begin with, and then there are certain things you can deduce from the axiom that human beings act. Okay, then there's going to be other economists who emphasize more what I'll call the realm of economic history, where they'll say, yes, okay, there's some deductive things that we can derive from science, the science of human action, but then there's also an inductive or an empirical aspect, which is what dominates most of economics today, where we engage in, the predictions and so forth. This is where, say, for example, Milton Friedman, in his essay on positive economics, would say, you can judge an economic model by its predictive power. Yep. Okay. And so again, broadly speaking, the economics as a field embraces both dimensions or approaches to economics, but then there's an internal debate over whether or not one is more appropriate than another for the field.
Yeah. So when we talk about economics as a social science, it has these various approaches.
Yep.
Why should the church take seriously this sort of thing? Because you talked, one of the things you pointed out that's shared actually by this empirically oriented and this more deductive approach
Yes.
is a sort of commitment to sort of value neutrality, and that ethics comes from somewhere else. The church is concerned with how to live rightly in the world, instructing people in faith and morals. Why should they even pay attention to a discipline that doesn't have a sort of at least straightforward contribution to morality and ethics?
Yes. So this is great. And this is where I think a dialogue between economics and, say, the church and Catholic social teaching and specifically is really important, because what economists bring to the table is, if you say, here is an end we're seeking to achieve, economists are in the business of describing what the trade-offs are involved in achieving the ends and the different means that you could try to pursue to achieve those ends. And so this is where some of those empirical methods are helpful. But even more to the point is the principles underlying economic trade-offs, say opportunity cost. What is the foregone opportunity if you pursue a certain path? What role do prices play in trade-offs and making decisions on the costs and benefits of certain actions? All of these things are really important if you're in the business of trying to achieve certain ends in the social sphere. And so economics has much to say about these things, and too often people pursue certain ends and they do so in a way that doesn't account for those important considerations.
Mm-hmm. So the church is interested in ends like securing the human dignity of persons through, political arrangements, through just ordering of society. They're interested in alleviation of poverty. They're interested in sort of how people can better peaceably get along with each other.
Yep.
And economics tells us something about the means.
That's right.
Now, I always think about, a lot of, there's morally we talk about how the ends don't justify the means, and and then embedded in the means themselves is a sort of moral content.
Yes.
As somebody who's reflected on Catholic social teaching for a long time and reflected on the discipline of economics, how do you think about that? Economists like to step back from this value neutral perspective, but is there a subtle moral content to economics that might not be as straightforward, but since we're talking about means, and since means and ends can't be separated ethically, is there something there that maybe most economists overlook? Yeah,
I think so. We do make that positive versus normative economics distinction in the field and trying to look at things objectively in the positive sense and, what is the objective outcome of a certain path of action. But you really can't separate the two, because even asking yourself about the ends that you're pursuing may very well presuppose a normative judgment, okay? So that's why I think that in economics we should not ignore the normative realities of, say, the policies that are being pursued or what have you. And so economics can benefit and should benefit from being informed by the ethical dimensions of any pursuit of ends or means that you're using to achieve those ends.
Yeah. A thinker who's very informed by the Austrian tradition, although not himself an Orthodox Austrian economist, Wilhelm Röpke, wrote a very wonderful essay called A Value Judgment on Value Judgments that was originally published in a Turkish journal. We translated it for the Journal of Markets and Morality. It was published there. It's anthologized in an anthology I did of William Röpke's writings called The Humane Economist.
Yes.
And Acton's former research director wrote a preface to that journal article called A Value Judgment on Value Judgments on Value Judgments.
That's
so we had this inception sort of thing.
Right.
So even economists take very seriously this question and explore some of these dimensions in which there is maybe some subtle positive content to economics.
Yes.
Now, Pope Francis in Laudato Si, he writes about how economists are actually essential, along with other disciplines, to informing the Church's social teaching. And I'm just going to quote, this is from paragraph 141. We urgently need a humanism capable of bringing together the different fields of knowledge, including economics, in the service of a more integral and integrating vision. Today, the analysis of environmental problems cannot be separated from the analysis of human of family work of human family work related in urban contexts, not from how individuals relate to themselves, which leads in turn to how they relate to others and to their environment. There is an interrelation between ecosystems and between various spheres of social interaction, demonstrating yet again that the whole is greater than the part. How well is this more integral and integrating vision being articulated today, both sort of in the church, which has invited the participation, at least in some sense, of these other disciplines to bear on these questions, and how much is that happening in the secular world?
Right.
That the church is seeking to sort of inform with its teachings, because
Yes,
there seems to be a recognition of a need, but how well that need is being, how well that integrating vision is coming forth, both in the church and in the world, is a more complicated question.
No, it is. I would say within the realm of academics and academic economists, it's become so highly specialized, and for good reason. So many of academic disciplines are by their nature become progressively specialized, and it's important work, but it also comes at the trade-off, once again, and that is oftentimes economists who are very focused on their specific subspecialty don't think about those broader interdisciplinary dimensions, which Pope Francis is alluding to here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you will then, I think, have other pockets of economists who do recognize that we need, and here we do it at the Acton Institute, we recognize we can't be economistic in this regard. We have to glean from other disciplines, whether it be anthropology, whether it be philosophy, to help inform some of the broader questions and challenges that we deal with in society today. So, sometimes economists get accused of being sort of imperialists, because we do see that human action and scarcity are ubiquitous, and therefore we can apply economic principles and concepts to virtually any kind of topic. But we don't want to only look at it from an economic angle. And as Pope Francis points out, that's something that needs to be done. We need to take a look at things from different fields and integrate them and see how they relate to one another.
Yeah. Frederick Hayek was fond of saying that an economist who's merely an economist is not only not a good economist, but also a positive danger.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's something.
Yes.
That there's something in this imperial mentality that can be very very counterproductive to studying something as ubiquitous as human action in the world.
That's right.
So we talked a little bit on the sort of secular discipline of economics. How is the church's reception of economics been? On the one hand, you have this call, this recognition that there's the economists have something to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
To this positive vision of the social world and the common good. But the church's reception of economics has been uneven at best.
Yes.
How do you account for that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think there's been, it's evolved. The church's connection to and embrace of economics and its social teaching has evolved. And if you take a look and use Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum as sort of the inaugural encyclical of social teaching, you can see that there's been a real emphasis early on in Catholic social teaching on what I would call the supply side of economics, which is to say, it's emphasized sort of the importance and the duties of businesses and the way they treat their workers and making sure that they treat them with human dignity and so forth. Over time, though, you now start to see that the Catholic Church has evolved and focuses a little bit more on the responsibilities and duties of consumers, right? So if you take a look at Centesimus Annus of John Paul II, if you take a look at Laudato Si of Francis, there's been a recognition that there's this two sides, supply and demand, right? And on the one hand, there's responsibilities in the economic domain for producers. At the same time, there's responsibilities in the economic domain of consumers. So that's kind of a broad picture of sort of the evolution, I think, of Catholic social teaching and its reception of economic ideas. But then at the same time, there's sort of a deeper question. And the deeper question is, what do we say about the role of things like private property? What do we have to say about, how does the church understand the nature of prices and how that informs, the way human beings interact with one another? And you could even take it a step further and say, what's the difference between justice in a distributive sense versus justice in a commutative or exchange sense? And it's been mixed. So I think there's been some both popes and clergymen who have been more receptive to certain concepts in economics, especially free enterprise economics, and then there have been others that have been more skeptical. So it's kind of a mixed record, you might say.
Yeah, and a lot of these figures. So I mean, the Rerum Novarum is sort of a landmark moment for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that it embraces sort of the terms that economists are using in the 19th century of land, labor, and capital.
Yes,
and
right.
applying the church's teaching to those categories. So even in the structure of it, you have earlier theologians that pursue questions about sort of, interests, money production, just prices, these sorts of things. We publish translations of many of these folks in our sources of early modern ethics, economics, and law, going back, to sort of early modern Europe. You get a lot of exploration of these topics and a lot of great original contributions to theologians to sort of the prehistory of economics.
Sure, the late scholastics, yes, right, yep.
But then you have this turn in the late 19th century where the churches, in Pope's social encyclicals, they're actually like taking up these categories and trying to work through them.
Yes.
Lord Acton saw sort of a great challenge of the church in the 19th century in a lot of ways is to coming to terms with science. And he had a sort of very broad conception of that and sort of like the German Wissenschaft, not only economics, but history, but all of these other elements of the modern world. And he viewed sort of the Rambler, the magazine that he edited, as sort of set up to fight on two fronts, with those who are of little faith and with those who have none at all, with those who for the sake of religion fear science and for the followers of science who despise religion. I think that's like very analogous to what we try to do at the Acton Institute
Sure.
with economics. What do you think is the challenge today? What do these two fronts look like as an economist who works at the Acton Institute and has to deal with these two fronts with both economists who might be skeptical of the normative claims of the church, and then with the church which might be skeptical of sort of the methodological or the empirical insights of economics?
Right. Well, I think a couple things that Acton tries to do here, we at the Acton Institute, is we want to make sure that people understand that although we can assess things economically, especially in human action and what conditions of scarcity entail, we have to remember that we're also social creatures, right? And so we look at the human person and we recognize as social creatures that our choices, our decisions, the way we interact in the marketplace has social implications for other creatures, right, for other people, to include the environment, which, Pope Francis, as you pointed out, has a lot to say about that throughout his papacy. So we want to make sure that people recognize this. And oftentimes we can, in economics, fail to think through the implications of human action on the broader social questions. I think from the church's standpoint, the church needs to recognize that economics does inform us. So, for example, that the optimum level of pollution is not zero.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's interesting. I used to say those kinds of things to my students. We want a clean environment, but a clean environment does not mean zero pollution, right? Because we have trade-offs involved. And so I think that when you have this intersection between what the church is trying to convey to people, as well as what economists are trying to convey to society about their discipline, there needs to be that integral discussion about these aspects of how human action affects society and what the economic implications are of moral proposals.
So let's get concrete a second, because one of the things that you did several months ago is you went through and talked about sort of immigration reform and migration issues, and talked through that in terms of Acton's core principles and in terms of Catholic social teaching, but also with the insights of economics. What are some other issues that you think, in a very concrete way, that economists have something to say to the church
Yes.
where that should really inform how the church chooses to try to pursue the common good in the world.
Yes. So one I already just alluded to,
Yes,
and that is the environment.
Yep.
So, it is interesting. We do, of course, have a moral obligation to protect the environment and other species. We want to protect one another. And, we understand that human activity, by its very nature, always impacts the environment, right?
Yep.
There's no isolating human activity from its effects. And, economists speak in terms of externalities, and that the things that we can do can create, over time, cumulative harms.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I think we need to remember is, although there is this effort to try to make sure that we preserve and conserve the goodness of our created environment, we also recognize that there are trade-offs involved, also in terms of both human life and life of other creatures, right? If we wanted to say we don't want to kill any other species, we would never drive cars, because we wouldn't, of course, want to smash bugs on our windshield, right?
Yeah.
And so there has to be some sort of a perspective of our understanding of the trade-offs involved.
Mm-hmm.
And economics speaks into those, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's important for any environmental advocate or environmental economist. They can have that dialogue and determine what those trade-offs are and the principles that are involved.
Yeah. And that's going to be contextual too.
That's
And
right.
This is something where you have, in the developing world, you have greater challenges in terms of, greater amounts of absolute poverty,
Mm-hmm.
where those trade-offs for economic development and environmental protection might be weighed very differently than in the context of the developed world,
Absolutely.
where you're already a very prosperous society.
Exactly. And by the way, that's another area, the whole topic of globalization.
Yes.
In international trade. The church, in its Catholic social teaching, has spoken into this quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, economists have as well, speaking so much about things like comparative advantage and how free trade can benefit, mutually benefit. Even if you are better at doing everything as a country than another country, there are still opportunities to gain from trade by allowing each country to specialize in what they do relatively better. But at the same time, it's not simply about exchange. And this is where the church can have some illuminating power over economists by saying, don't forget, there is something called culture.
Yeah.
There's something called community. And all of those things actually matter to a flourishing society.
What are some other sort of concrete things where the church really has something to teach economists, either in sort of drawing their attention to areas? I mean, the church has spoken for much of the 20th century very strongly and very forcefully against population control measures.
Right.
And now economists are very worried about long-term growth, because we're actually, projected in many countries throughout the world to see population declines. And that is going to present economic challenges that economists of earlier generations didn't seriously consider. I know you've done some work on this, and I'd like to talk to you about this in particular, but then also explore some other issues too. But where does the church's teaching on sort of population control?
Yes,
is something where I think the church had something that economists should have been listening to.
Yes.
And didn't.
Now, I will say, fortunately, economists have tended to be a bit more optimistic about population growth than, say, ecologists or other academic disciplines. So, nevertheless, you are right. I mean, there has been, even among economists, concern and skepticism at some level about population growth, especially rapid population growth. And the church has always reminded folks that human beings are inherently good, just, even though we're fallen, that there's the goodness to the human person, and therefore we shouldn't fear people, but embrace people for the goodness that they are, and therefore, population growth is a good thing. And in fact, we are not simply consumers, but we are creative and producers. And so we can learn and figure out how to make our world a better place, even in the midst of increasing pressures on those resources as population grows. So that's a couple of things that the church has, I think, brought to the table that help economists. But when it comes to just kind of broader issues, this whole population question and what the church has done to help and could help the field of economics is by focusing more on what the church does really well, which is, who is man?
Yeah.
Right? Who is man? In fact, that's the essence of Catholic social teaching, pointing us back to what does it mean to be human and our relationship both as human beings to God and to one another. And so this, I think, is something that economists would do well to listen, because when we talk about things like positive and negative externalities, those are things where we could listen to what the church has to say about our impacts of our behavior and our choices on the rest of humanity, on the rest of the created order, and would be very useful for economists to listen to.
The world is going through like a lot of challenges today. Migration is one of those things that the church has been very focused on. Mm-hmm. We mentioned earlier trade. These are areas in which there was sort of broad consensus among economists and for a large part many policymakers, and at least the developed Western world. A lot of that is being reevaluated today. A lot of nations, including the United States, are tariffs are back in a big way.
Right.
We're also seeing increased. It's not just in the United States.
Sure.
This is sort of a trend we see in a lot of the developed world. Is a lot of nations turning more inward, both in terms of immigration policy and in terms of trade policy. The church has spoken out very forcefully in favor of the rights of migrants.
Sure.
But has been, I think, less forceful in its articulation. Although I think you correctly point out the church does see there's a role for international trade and development, but has been less forceful in that. Are there like these issues, and maybe on some other issues? Are there some places where sort of economics and the church now find themselves as sort of strange allies in an increasingly sort of polarized and populist world?
Yes. So, it's interesting. The whole trade topic, which of course has become much more focused upon with the increase in tariffs and what President Trump has been doing, it's made a little bit more complex by what I'll call the distinction between tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. Mm-hmm. So economists, I think, are still generally in agreement that free trade is a good thing, and we should endeavor to try to remove trade barriers for at least economic well-being. There are those cultural questions that arise that should be part of the discussion too, perhaps. But what we don't quite know going on behind the scenes is what's happening in the non-tariff trade barrier arena. Mm-hmm. And those things you'd have to dig into a little bit more to the policy negotiations to find out. Maybe on the one hand, there might be just a raw tariff increase, but a major reduction in non-tariff trade barriers, which economists say, maybe it's a net positive. Yeah. So those are kind of policy issues that we'd have to get into in another setting. But when it comes to migration and other things that the church could be becoming more allied with economists are generally pro-migration just like they're pro-trade, which is to say that human beings, insofar as they're the ultimate resource, and insofar as they respect the rule of law when they go from, migrate from one country to another, they are net positives to a society from an economic standpoint. And so when the church defends the rights of migrants, there's also an economic dimension to this too, where the economists would typically be allied. Mm-hmm. Now, again, it's a much more complicated topic when you talk about legal versus illegal immigration and so forth. And by the way, the flip side, the right of people not to feel compelled to migrate. Yes. Right? Which is very important. The church underscores that as well, perhaps not emphasizing enough as it should. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you that for every gain that one country makes from a migrant coming into their country, that's a loss for the other country, right? In fact, there's the expression, the brain drain, right? And that's a real phenomenon where the best talent leaves a country because the conditions aren't conducive for them to make use of their talents. And so really as an economist and as a Catholic social teaching would point out, those countries that are losing their best people need to ask themselves why. Yeah. Right?
And there are institutions, I always talk about, years ago on an episode of Acton Unwind, we were talking about migration issues, and I said, the demand for America outstrips the supply for America.
Yes.
And that we have this very robust set of institutions that enable people to flourish here. And to flourish and to really come from anywhere in the world and hit the ground running.
That's right.
Have massive gains to productivity. That's a real blessing. But that is something that if we're talking about in terms of social science and economics, we know that there's an underlying human nature and there's a way that human action works. That if you can get similar institutional arrangements in other countries, people should be able to flourish anywhere.
That's right.
As long as you create a system of institutional arrangements that are compatible with human flourishing.
Exactly.
And that's something we should be looking to do and to see develop around the world.
For sure.
We talked a little bit about different sort of traditions and interpretive traditions in economics. The more sort of empirical, the more sort of humanistic or praxeological, or, we could use all sorts of terms. The Austrian tradition is one of these sort of exemplary traditions that centers this. Some of those, I think, are more open to the church's social teaching. I think the more human-centered Austrian tradition is going to naturally be inclined to pay attention to a social tradition like the church's that is focused on the identity of the human person.
Yes.
Things like that. Are there also differences in interpretive traditions of the church's social teaching that are more or less hostile to economics?
Yes, I think so. And we may even say more narrowly hostile to, say, a free enterprise form of economics. Certainly there is, at least let me begin with, the church has made it quite clear in its social teaching that there are two extreme forms of economics. You might call them socialism and communism on the one hand, and then the other side, and anarcho-capitalism on the other hand, which are both out of bounds from a Catholic social teaching standpoint, because there's something fundamentally wrong with the underlying anthropologies of those types of economic systems or philosophies. Within sort of what we might more broadly call, let's just call it market economics, whether it's completely free or relatively controlled or what have you. I would say that within the Catholic Church, anything that's coming out of, say, the sort of the liberation theology perspective is going to be much more skeptical of private property rights and the recognition of human beings being able to be free to engage in transactions in marketplace. And they're going to be much more interventionist in trying to use the power of the state and perhaps the power of the church to be able to redistribute and just achieve certain ends and economic ends which the marketplace wouldn't naturally generate on its own. So you might even call it sort of a hyper-egalitarianism. So I think that there's certain branches within Catholicism of sort of along those kinds of liberation theology lines that would be less receptive to what we understand of certain economic principles, right? Outside of that, I mean, I'm not sufficiently familiar with different, say, schools of interpretation within the Catholic Church to be able to point to anything more definitive than that. But that would be one example where they would say, no, we don't like the economic ideas you're presenting to us. It's going to exploit human beings. Right?
Yeah. And this is primarily, this is an adaptation of sort of Marxist insights into alienation of labor, these sorts of things that are then transposed. You also have folks that we might say are on, if we identify sort of the liberation theology tradition as like sort of a left-wing tradition.
Right.
We also have a sort of right-wing corporatist tradition.
Yes.
In
That's a good point.
Sort of Catholic social teaching. A lot of sort of the fascist regimes in Europe during the 20s, 30s, 40s adapted, actually some of them continuing in the 50s, 60s, 70s as well, in Portugal and in Spain, adapted at various times different economic policies, but many of them a sort of corporatist policy.
Very good point. I didn't think about that.
What do we make of those sorts of critics?
Well, I think that the corporatist tradition are those who would seek to use the power of the state to sort of run the levers of the economy in a different direction. I think they give they don't sufficiently account for, say, some of the critiques that people make, say, from the public choice arena, where the public choice school of economics emphasizes that, hey, look, there's always incentives at play. And if an individual or if a corporation knows that it can get in good with the state and have advantages steered toward them for their own ends, well, they're going to pursue that. And next thing you know, you're not going to get the kinds of outcomes in the long run that you want. And so that corporatist tradition gives, I guess, too much weight to the benefits that could derive from the state gaining control or supporting a certain part of the economy and its apparatus and its corporations. Yeah.
So there are all sorts of sort of live issues in the world right now. One of them. I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about this because it's very, very recent. We talked about your work in applying Catholic social teaching in economics to the question of migration.
Right.
What sort of insights could we gain from sort of both traditions about the recent sort of partial nationalization of Intel? Because when we talk about these forms of corporatism, President Trump recently acquired, as he reminded on his True Social post, that he got this 10% stake for America for free. And that why are people criticizing him when he acquired all of this value for the American people? Let's put on sort of two separate hats,
right,
and think through this in terms of Catholic social teaching and in terms of economics, and we can take those in any order that you'd like, or develop a sort of integrated response.
So it's interesting, and this is a little off the cuff here from a Catholic social teaching standpoint, but the thing that would come to mind is the concept of justice. Like, what is it about Intel that requires the government not only to assert itself in partial ownership of the company, but also then effectively giving them an inside path to special favors and so forth in a regulatory sense. There's going to be competitors out there that say, I'm not so sure that I want the government to be involved with Intel like that, because I have a better idea to create microchips and I've got a better way of doing it and I'm going to be successful, but I don't know that the government's going to allow me to be so because they've got a stake in Intel's success. Yeah. Right? So I think that there's a justice question here. And a similar thing, just along the lines of competition, from an economic standpoint, you're making an investment in something that could end up failing anyway. And you're also potentially disrupting the level playing field from a competition standpoint and not necessarily serving the ends that you want to achieve, which is the benefits of the consumer, right? Now, I suppose somebody could jump in and say, well, there's some national security arguments here that we have to address. Well, okay, that may very well be. Let's set that aside and talk about that in a different context about what national security concerns are at play, because we do know that there are some limitations to trade. We don't want all of our trade secrets, for example, shared with other countries and from a military standpoint. But from a pure economics or a pure Catholic social teaching standpoint, I think the questions of justice and competition are really important here.
So when we talk about it from that angle of justice, competition, we also talk about sort of private property rights.
Absolutely.
Because we also have, this is something that in Rerum Novarum, private property is sort of the cornerstone to a civilization, and that these rights are sort of sacred. And when you create, what does that do? Let's take a look at, and this is where the insights of economics can actually inform our discussion of Catholic social teaching. When a stake is just given like this,
right?
What does that do to the value of the other shareholders before that stake was given?
That's right.
What does that do? Yeah.
Certainly there's a transfer of wealth, and now I don't know how the stake was acquired, whether they just purchased it, at the going market share price, in which case there would have been a transaction to whoever is operating the government's stake, right? So I'm not quite sure how it actually manifested, but if it's like, hey, we're going to jump in here and you're going to generate new shares, right, out of nothing, and those are going to be purely government owned, well, then there is going to be a dilution of the value of the other shares, right? So other things being equal.
Yes.
So that certainly then, once again, is a violation of private property, just the dilution of other people's share of ownership by virtue of creating a new owner.
So when you look at this from an economic perspective, this does a couple different things. One is sort of the market disruptions that we've talked about. It also creates a sort of uncertainty as to there are all sorts of other firms that are plausibly related to national security, or that, plausibly, the government could assert some sort of claim over. What is this sort of policy environment where private property rights in major firms are sort of up for grabs? what does that do market wide, and how could that affect not just Intel and its shareholders, but sort of the broader American economy?
Right. Well, I do think that the policy environment itself, to the extent that it's become uncertain, is going to make investors and entrepreneurs hesitate.
Yeah.
Right. You see the exact same thing with the whole tariff regime. Right. There was all sorts of hesitation to invest or to take that next step or to redivert your productions from China to Vietnam or whatever the case may be. So an unstable, uncertain policy environment can make it very difficult for the economy to flourish. When it comes to national security, there are important questions that need to be addressed. But at the same time, that could just become a catch-all, right, to justify any intervention. So it really comes down to a matter of prudence and what really constitutes a national security issue that the government needs to step in and either regulate something more or write the law and the rules of the game differently so that we don't lose out to risks of adversaries.
So if there are many listeners that A, aren't Catholic,
Yep.
or B, are Catholic but are just vaguely aware of the Church's social teaching, and they're they know every so often they'll hear in a homily Rerum Novarum or Centesimus Annis, but they haven't really spent any time with these documents, any time considering this tradition. To either your average Roman Catholic that's not very engaged in the teaching, or to Protestants, to Jews, to Muslims, to other listeners who maybe not of a Catholic faith tradition, but are sort of intrigued by some of the things we've been talking about. What's a good place for folks to go to get a sort of introduction to this teaching?
Yes. Well, I do have, if I could just toot my own here, there is an article in the Journal of Markets and Morality that I wrote about a little over a decade ago, so it's getting a little dated, but of course the Catholic social teaching is dated too.
Yeah.
So it'll take you at least through Centesimus Annus and I think Caritas and Veritate by Pope Benedict on just what has happened with Catholic social teaching over time. It's the development of Catholic social teaching in the papal encyclicals. There are other sources out there that I just don't have off the top of my head that you could look at in terms of books. Maybe you have a couple in mind.
I always think of there's a startling amount in the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
if you just go through, particularly because again, a lot of these are rooted in the human person, nature of the human person, and a lot of these are rooted in the Church's moral theology. So particularly those sections on the Ten Commandments.
Yep.
There are economic applications through that are actually made in the Church's social teaching And
certainly if you're asking for church documents, then certainly there is an entire chapter in the Compendium on Catholic social teaching. So there's a compendium that the Catholic Church published. I think it was initially published in 2005.
That's about right.
And there's an entire section on economics. There's an entire chapter on labor. Right? And so if you wanted to find out, and of course Catholic social teaching is much broader than the field of economics. There's questions of ecology, there's questions of the human person and community, culture, et cetera. But there are a couple of chapters that specifically go through the underlying principles, and maybe that's an important point to highlight. Catholic social teaching is not the same as dogma, and it's not the same as its ethical teaching or its moral teaching. What it seeks to do is to apply both theology and ethics to the common issues of humanity. And that requires a certain amount of prudence, right? Yep. So you're going to have principles of Catholic social teaching, and then it's up to societies in their particular historical context to be able to apply those principles to these more complex questions. Yeah.
This is one of the things that I always tell folks, and actually I hear a lot from Protestant interlocutors. I've interviewed I think Reverend John Nunez. Several years ago, we talked about how much that as a Lutheran he's gotten out of Catholic social teaching because like a lot of these differences among religious traditions are really are real differences and dogmatic differences in some cases. But a lot of the social teaching can be is equally resonant among different traditions. Yes. Jordan Bowler, former research scholar at the Acton Institute, edited Makers of Modern Christian Social Thought volume for us, which pairs
Yes.
Rerum Novarum with Abraham Kuyper's first address to the Christian Social Congress, and in a
Right.
great introduction, sort of talks about common threads. So, like, the church's social teaching is the church's, but it's also it's really for the entire world, and for
Absolutely.
believers and unbelievers alike, and people of various religious traditions. It's a great resource for reflections on these topics. The other thing, and this is we get the economics hat on, is what would be a good place for somebody who, let's say, and from the opposite perspective, maybe they've dug deeply into the church's social teaching. They're very familiar with the church's normative commitments on moral questions.
Right.
But they're struggling with the means, the best way to sort of realize these commitments, and they realize, as Pope Francis did, that economics has something to say here and something to contribute to these solutions. Where would be a good place for those people to get a sort of introduction to economics and some of these insights?
Yes. So a couple of things I would say right off the bat is go to our own Acton On Demand website.
Yeah.
And there you can find our core lectures, one of which is an economics lecture by Dr. Ann Bradley, and she gives a fantastic talk on the essence of free enterprise economics and what economics is all about. The economic way of thinking, I think, is the title of the talk. So right off the bat, that's a good resource. We also have the Call of the Entrepreneur documentary, which really underscores the vocation of people who are called to be entrepreneurs or who have the natural gifts to be able to serve the community through bringing new ideas into the marketplace. So that's another great resource. I would always advocate anything by Wilhelm Röpke.
Yep.
And I would also, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt is a fantastic first lesson in economics.
It's an amazing book. So the way that book is structured, and I want to have actually Dave Hebert on this program to go through the chapters. The way it's structured is the fundamental lesson of economics. And that's one chapter. And it's a brilliant, if you read anything, that one chapter is a great one. And then every other chapter is an application of that lesson to various issues that we all are still live political and policy issues today. And it's absolutely great place to begin. Stephen, thanks you so much for being with us today and for sharing your insights. And we will include that Journal Markets and Morality piece, as well as your immigration piece in the show notes, and all those other wonderful references you gave. Thank you for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.